Hello, hello. Welcome to the Read-Aloud Revival podcast, the show that helps families fall in love with books and fall in love with homeschooling. I'm your host, Sarah Mackenzie. Today, I want to talk about my own favorite reading genre, a lot of your favorites too, because we did a poll not too long ago at RAR Premium to ask which genre you most like to read for fun. And so many of you said my answer, which is historical fiction. We all love some good historical fiction. So I knew just who to invite on the show to talk about historical fiction. Anna Rose Johnson is here. She's not only a fellow lover of reading historical fiction, but also she's a writer of historical fiction and some excellent historical fiction at that. We're going to talk all about it. She's the award-winning author of The Star That Always Stays, a middle-grade historical fiction novel that is on several of my book lists, and The Luminous Life of Lucy Landry, an utterly fabulous title, a completely charming story. I like to describe it as a perfect read if you love Lucy Maud Montgomery, set in a Michigan lighthouse. Anna Rose is here to chat with me all things historical fiction, writing it, reading it, all the good stuff. Anna Rose, welcome to the Read-Aloud Revival. So glad you're here.
Well, thank you so much for asking me. It's such a delight.
So, historical fiction is my own favorite genre. I know I get a lot of great recommendations from your website. In fact, I believe you're the one who recommended, or maybe you just had it on your website, Miss Bunkle's book by D.E. Stevenson. And I was like, I've never heard of this before. And then I went and got the audiobook and just loved it so much. So I loved it so much we chose it as a Mama Book Club pick for this next coming year.
That's great. It's such a fun book.
Have you always loved historical fiction? As a kid, did you read it? Tell me more about that.
So I always loved, particularly the Edwardian era, even from a very young age. I loved stories that took place in that time, books and movies and TV shows. Even from when I was like 6 or 7 years old, I loved the Betsy Tacy books. And later I got another old catalog of Cars from 1904. And so I just loved that time period. So then later on, I ended up writing in that time period as well. So yeah, I just was always very, very drawn to that. I was homeschooled and I had a lot of time to focus on my stories when I was younger. And I played, very imaginative games, and they were usually set like in turn of the century. I would write stories based on those games. And so yeah, I've been reading and writing historical fiction for a long time. I like to say that, I started writing historical fiction when I was 7, but I didn't start actually researching it until I was maybe 12. So yeah, and then I continued to write historical fiction, but then I switched to writing contemporary stories when I was a little older, because I saw that, so many middle grade novels were contemporary, and I thought that's what I should do. So it really wasn't until I got the idea for The Star That Always Stays when I was 16 that I returned to, my first love of historical fiction, and, have not looked back since then. And so, yeah, historical fiction has just always been such a favorite of mine. I read quite a bit of historical fiction, as a kid. A lot of what I read at that age, and this is still the case now, is more just vintage books that were written in the first half of the 20th century. Noel Streatfeild and Elizabeth Enright, books like that. And yeah, even books written in the early 1900s, I liked a lot. And so I think that reading so many vintage books at that age is one of the reasons why I personally like historical fiction. It's a little bit different than a lot of typical historical fiction, where it's like, for example, this is a book about the Great Depression and here are some characters in this time period. Whereas I like to read and to write books where it's more, you start with, here's a character and the story happens to take place during the Great Depression.
So the setting then provides a backdrop for this character who's very primary for you in your writer's mind. It doesn't surprise me that you love books like Elizabeth Enright and Noel Streatfeild's books. I mean, I feel like that same tone of big family stories, siblings kind of banding together, it's really present in your books in surprising ways sometimes. So that's really fun. That's fun. I'm just curious, like when we asked in RAR Premium, what's your favorite genre? I mean, the overwhelming response was historical fiction. I just wonder why, like, what is it about the genre that you think maybe I was gonna say that appeals to people, but maybe just what is it about it that appeals to you? Maybe that's what we could talk about is like, what appeals to us about historical fiction?
Yeah, I thought that was quite fun that those were the poll results. I voted for historical, of course. So it was fun to see that so many others chose that as well. Yeah, I think that for me, I've always thought that historical fiction is just a really fun way to learn about history and just it doesn't feel like you're learning anything exactly. It's just more you're absorbing the story and you absorb the history along with that. And there's just so much that you can learn from historical fiction. And I just really like that. I love it when there's surprising things that I didn't know about previously in history in books. And I think a lot of people enjoy that aspect of it. What I really like about writing historical fiction is that ability to introduce readers to history that, might be new to them. Yeah, I really love that aspect of it.
You know, it's so interesting because I feel like I'm not a huge fantasy reader. I read a lot of fantasy with my kids because
Mhm.
they love fantasy, but maybe I don't read any fantasy on my own. I'm trying to think if I ever really have, mostly for a Read-Aloud Revival book list or to read with my kids. But actually, I think the same thing that appeals, like that same like immersive experience that sort of like completely enraptures you and takes you into a different time and place is the same thing. I mean, early 20th century might as well be a fantasy land compared to what we live in now, right? Like it's
Uh-huh.
completely talk about world building. I mean, you've got to do some serious world building if you're going to write a story that's set in 1908
Mhm.
because it's a completely different world than we live in now. So I feel like the same kind of getting swept away in a story or taken to another time or place I feel that when I read like a vintage story or like Anne of Green Gables. I feel that way just as much as if I read Narnia. They both feel like equally portals to another place for me.
Absolutely. And I think that that's, yeah, maybe why so many young readers like historical fiction, because it kind of offers a different perspective. There's a lot of young readers want the experience of something different and unique when they're reading. And, a lot of the times contemporary books mirror their own lives pretty well. And I think that that's why so many like fantasy, but historical fiction allows young readers to experience a story where so many things are the same as life today, but then there's also something else, something a little bit unfamiliar. So yeah, I think that historical fiction offers a really good blend of like the familiar and the unique.
Okay, so let's talk about your books in particular, which are all over our book list because we love them so much. The first, The Star That Always Stays, which came out a couple of years ago. Do you want to give our listeners, watchers, a little quick summary of what the story is? I should have done that for you, but it's been a little while since I've read it. So now I feel like you'd probably do a better job than I would.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, The Star That Always Stays was a story inspired by the childhood of my great grandmother. So it's about a 14-year-old girl named Norvia, and she moves from Beaver Island to Boyne City, Michigan in 1914 when her parents divorce and her mother remarries. And so it's a lot of her trying to adjust to that change, as well as the fact that her mother wants her to hide the fact that they have Native American heritage. So it's a coming of age story with a lot of fun elements.
It does, and it has, like, a lot of nods to those same vintage stories you were talking about loving. So, I mean, it is, like I always am like, if you love Lucy Maud Montgomery, if you love Elizabeth Henry, if you love, like, those kinds of stories, you're gonna love it. It's just exactly that kind of book. One thing I appreciate so much about your stories, both The Star That Always Stays and The Luminous Life of Lucy Landry, which has to be, just for the record, one of the best titles ever. I mean, you got me before I even saw the cover, which is also an amazing cover. But The Luminous Life of Lucy Landry, are you kidding me? Like, sign me up. I'm reading this book today. Anyway, both of them tell the story of girls who have Ojibwe heritage, which is not something we see in a lot of those vintage or historical novels that we love from that time period. So tell me more about that.
I really liked including that aspect in these stories for that very reason, because I think it adds just, an extra element, different perspective for these kinds of stories that are very classic. There's so many stories that kind of follow these coming of age stories for girls at this time in history. So yeah, I really enjoyed being able to put that in and, introduce readers to a little bit of Ojibwe culture. So yeah, it's very special to me, especially in The Star That Always Stays, because that was, inspired by my family history. So yeah, I just think that it's fun to be able to get a story in that style, but with a character with heritage that isn't always explored.
Okay, so your second book, The Luminous Life of Lucy Landry, do you want to give us a little summary of that one, a little introduction to that one?
Yeah. So The Luminous Life of Lucy Landry is about, of course, Lucy Landry. And she is 11 years old, and she is an orphan. And when her guardian passes away, she has to go and live with a family who live in a lighthouse. And it's a big family, and Lucy has a little bit of trouble fitting in. She has a very big imagination. She's also looking for a treasure that she thinks could be washed up on shore near the lighthouse. So it's a little bit of a mystery.
Yeah, she's got a big imagination and a tongue that gets her in trouble sometimes.
Yes.
Okay, so you said something a minute ago that I know some listeners were like, wait, Sarah, go back, ask her about that. Don't worry, I didn't miss it. You said you had the idea for The Star That Always Stays when you were 16. So tell me, how old were you when you wrote that book? Like how did that unfold for you?
Yes. So I was 16 when I got the idea and when I wrote it, because I wrote it like immediately after I got the idea.
Okay. Amazing.
And I was doing it for NaNoWriMo that year, and it was the first time I had done that. And
we should probably tell our listeners what NaNoWriMo is, just in case they haven't heard of it.
Yes, the National Novel Writing Month takes place in November each year, and writers try to get to 50,000 words in a book project. I did not get to 50,000 words on that first try. I got to 40,000, but it is still, I thought it was pretty good because, at that point I hadn't written very many longer projects. So it was a really good experience for me. So yeah, that was when I wrote the first draft, and it basically is completely different now. I had to rewrite the book from scratch, a couple of times. So yeah, it wasn't until several years after that I rewrote it again to be more of what the book is now. So yeah, it was a very fun process. I mean, I still wrote the majority of the book as it is today. As a teenager, I was still 19 when I did that.
Wow.
So yeah, it's quite cool.
So NaNoWriMo, I think I'm not forgetting, I hope I'm not speaking this out of turn. I'm pretty sure this is an accurate memory, that Karina Young Glazer, who wrote The Vanderbeekers of 141st Street, actually wrote her first version of that book during NaNoWriMo. And she said, if I remember this correctly, I hope I'm not getting you mixed up with someone else, Karina, that her story ended up changing completely from what she wrote in NaNoWriMo. But she found all the characters and like the family and like the tone. Mm-hmm. And I think, oh, wow. I mean, that's a lot to find in 1 month of writing. So that's amazing. I love this so much. I love hearing when something that a lot of people do, like NaNoWriMo, that gets like a lot of galvanizing action, like writers everywhere all over the world participate in this. And if you've got a young writer, this is just a fun challenge for them to do some version of NaNoWriMo. I did not know that you did that for this book, and that's really fun. So for me, I love historical fiction so much. I love historical fiction for adults. I love it for middle grade. I love YA historical fiction a lot of times. I'm very intimidated to think about writing it because it feels so research heavy and it feels like so many things could get wrong. Tell me about your research process. What does that look like? And do you ever get like worried that you're going to get something wrong?
Yes, I think that's always a bit of a worry for historical writers. We do a lot of research, and yeah, you do want to get everything as close as you possibly can. I do a lot of research, and I do it over a long period of time. And I think that it's something that I've talked to other young writers about, where they'll say, I would really love to write historical fiction, but, all the research just sounds so hard. And
Like, where do you start? That's what it feels like to me, like,
yes,
oh,
what I try and tell people is that you don't have to do all of that research right off the bat. What I like to do is just get the basic background information that I'm going to need for the book, like this first layer of research, just so that I can get through the first draft with it, mostly being accurate. And then as I continue to write the next few drafts and revise, then I try to add in more research as I go. So I think that doing it in layers, knowing that you don't have to do everything right off the bat, you can research more as it goes on, and things are going to come up when you're editing, especially as you change things. There's going to be things you didn't realize you would have to research. So I think that that maybe can take some of the pressure off. It doesn't have to be so overwhelming right at the beginning. So yeah, I do a lot of research. I love researching old newspapers and magazines, getting ideas from those. I really like going back to some of those old books, books written during the time that I'm writing about. I find that very helpful with the dialogue, especially getting a feel for what that would sound like. I really like reading, nonfiction books about whatever place that I'm writing about, because that helps me get a better feel for it. I look at lots of, old pictures, and it's a lot of different things that I do to research. But eventually it all kind of comes together.
when you're looking for research, do you like always have a first thing you go to? Do you always go to books? Do you always like search on YouTube for videos? Like, like what do you do? Like, what are you looking for?
I've done pretty much everything that
Okay.
like people recommend, but I would say starting out with research, it's usually a book. I typically start with settings.
Oh, okay.
So like with Lucy, it was the lighthouse setting. I knew I wanted it to be a lighthouse on Lake Superior. And so that narrows your research pretty well so that you know basically what you're looking for. So yeah, I just started reading a lot of books and blog posts about lighthouses, and yeah, watching some videos with like lighthouse tours. And
Yeah, reading your book, it was, I mean, because I'm from the Pacific Northwest, I had no idea that you were lakes out there. I mean, I know there are the Great Lakes, but like, I did not know they're basically like little mini oceans.
yeah.
It's like, I just had no idea they were such forces to be reckoned with. As you were talking, one of the things I was thinking of is Susan Meisner. She's one of my favorite historical fiction authors. She writes adult historical fiction, mostly set in World War II time, like period of time. And she has a few that are not in World War II. But I heard her on an interview once say, actually, at this point, a World War II novel is a lot more comfortable for her to write because she's done so much research for one book, you can carry it to the next. So she thinks that's oftentimes why authors, because their interest lies at a certain period of time in history, but also their expertise is they're getting more and more research done as they do their
Mhm.
writing. So do you find that too? Are both of your books set in about the same time period?
Yes, they're both set in the 1910s. And yeah, that comes from the fact that, I always had, such an affinity for the turn of the century stories. I didn't know as much about the 1910s specifically, especially like World War One. And the Strahd always stays set at the very beginning of World War One in Europe. Growing up, I really liked the American Girls books. And I think when I was 11, a new American Girl doll and series came out, and it was the Rebecca books. And I really loved those. And they were set in 1914. And I was very fascinated by that, learning new things about that particular period in time. And so then later, when I was doing research on my great grandmother, then I realized that I could set her story in that same year. And I really wanted to do that.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the initial spark. So yeah, and then Lucy's set in 1912. And I wanted it to be in that same general time because when I was doing the research for lighthouses, a lot of the material that I was finding was from that time. A lot of the stories I found about families who had lived at lighthouses, things that people had written was from that time. So I eventually settled on 1912. And then
Okay.
later I was able to visit a lighthouse on Lake Superior for research. And that was restored to 1915. So it was cool that it was pretty close.
Yeah, that's so cool. What was the hardest part? What do you find to be the most challenging part about writing? It could just either be specific to your books or the historical fiction genre in general.
I would say as far as writing historical fiction, one of the hardest things for me has been finding like the exact piece of research that I'm looking for. Like sometimes I'll have very specific questions. How did this work, or what was this like at this particular time in this particular place? And I want to get like this exact answer, and that's not always available. So you kind of have to do your best with what other information you could find. Maybe you can't find something for that exact time and place, but maybe you can find, something for a similar place. So yeah, that can be tricky to find exactly what I want. Just in general, some of the hardest parts of writing my books, I would say for The Star That Always Stays, it was tricky to get the 3-act story structure correct for it. And that was partly because I did write it when I was, younger,
Mhm.
because it started out, when I was 16, and I didn't really understand 3-act structure that well. Hadn't done a lot of reading on it. I know your basic beginning, middle, end, but the 3-act structure being more drawing those out a bit, making sure that it hits these specific beats. That was a little trickier for me. So it took a lot of revisions to make sure that I got that right. I think one of the hardest parts with Lucy, truthfully, was just like sending it off the last time to my publisher when I was done with edits, because I have a hard time knowing that the book is done and I can't change anything else.
Like, this is it. This is the last time you get to touch
Yep.
this thing, and then it's yeah. Inscribed in stone,
Yes.
basically, more or less. I think one of the things that I love about historical fiction specifically is that it tells the story of one person, which to me, I feel like when I look back on, what do I know about the Civil War, for example? I know a little tiny bit that I can remember maybe from a textbook that I learned in school. But for the most part, everything I know about the Civil War is because I read historical fiction novels set during the Civil War. And there's something about the one story of this person. And I think it also helps us and it helps our kids look back and see that these were not just like, if you look at facts and dates and wars and things like that, it's really hard to understand. There's like a whole human there with like fears and joys and weaknesses and strengths and desires and like hopes and dreams. And one story that tells the story of one specific part of their life or one person's life, it just feels different. It hits us differently. And I think that's like gotta be one of the fun parts about writing historical fiction, and also one of the challenging parts about writing historical fiction, I would think, is like I get to tell this one person's story, but can I do it without giving them my modern brain? Like how we think about XYZ now is different than they thought about it back then. Is that something
Mhm.
that's challenging for you at all?
Yeah, I try very hard to make sure that my novels seem authentic to, yeah, what people were talking about and thinking about at that time. And like I said, with the dialogue, that can be challenging. You have to make sure that it just feels real to the reader, and you want, yeah, all different aspects of it to feel real. That's why it can be really helpful to read books that were written during the time period that you're writing about, because that I think helps a lot with that, just to, yeah, get a better feel for what people's perspectives were.
So you said you were homeschooled and you had a lot of time to work on your stories. And we have a lot of listeners who homeschool and a ton of young writers listening who are dying for me to ask you what's been like the most impactful or useful things that you did or that your parents did or that you had access to growing up and in your early years of adult writing. Like, what are the things that you're like, oh yes, this made a big difference? Because I think there's a lot of parents listening and a lot of kids listening who want to be writers or who are raising writers, and they're like, what do we do? How do we give our kids what they need? So I'd love your take on that.
There have been, yeah, a lot of things that have impacted my writing in major ways. And I think as a kid, a big part of it was having lots of opportunities and time to, play those imaginative games, and then, write down stories about them. And yeah, just having the time to do that, I think is a big thing. And yeah, my parents were super supportive of my writing and made sure that I had access to, computers and having so many books. We had so many books, and different kinds of books, that it made it easier to figure out, oh, well, I like this kind of story, historical fiction. And so, yeah, I think that was a big thing when I was younger. And I think the fact that I reread so much. I was very particular about the books that I liked. And so I would just tend to reread the same ones over and over again. And I think that that really helped me as a writer because it's like when I was rereading, I was getting like a good ear for the way sentences are built and like how dialogue should sound. And I think if you read a story just once, you don't quite retain the great writing the same way. But if you read it, over and over again, then it can help your own writing so much. So that was definitely very important for me. And yeah, so then later on, when I was older, then I was able to get, more individual help with my writing, and my publishing journey. And that was really invaluable. And I did that. I was a student in the Young Writers Workshop and then later in the Author Conservatory with Brett Harris and Kara Swanson. And they really helped me so much because, when you're younger and you're working on stories, a lot of the time you're just doing it all by yourself and you're not like asking for feedback on your stories. And later on, being able to get feedback from industry professionals, that's a really helpful thing.
Yes. Okay. So that was a fun conversation I had actually on a previous episode. Episode number 235 was all about how to give feedback on your child's creative writing, even if you're not a writer. And the Young Writers Workshop team, Brett Harris and Kara Swanson from Young Writers Workshop and the Author Conservatory came on. So if you have a young writer, I would highly recommend listening to that episode 235, readaloudrevival.com/235. So that's so fun. And I remember realizing, like, making the connection between like, oh, Honors Johnson has done this program. That's so great. So that's really fun that those like worlds sort of collided in my brain. Like, of course you're a good storyteller. Let's talk about some of those favorites books that your own favorite historical fiction. You mentioned reading and rereading the same book again and again. What books were those? Let's start there.
Very early on, it was the Betsy Tacy books. Those I read a lot of times. So like those first four when they're younger.
Yeah.
And then, of course, later on when I was in high school, then I read the high school books, and that was quite fun.
It's been a while since I've read them, but I totally can see you rereading and rereading those. That fits so perfectly.
Yeah, I really loved those books. And I also really liked Happy Little Family by Rebecca Caudill. That's good historical fiction. I really like the American Girls books, and I love the mysteries that they did. And so two that I particularly liked were Midnight in Lonesome Hollow and The Puzzle of the Paper Daughter. Those are really good. And I think that last one was really the book that got me interested in doing genealogy research because that's how they figure out the mystery. And I thought it sounded like so much fun because they like look through microfilm, and I just thought it was so cool.
I love that. And I could totally see that connection. By the way, everybody listening, or if you are folding laundry or driving to soccer practice or on a walk or whatever you're doing at the moment, we'll put all these books in the show notes. So don't worry if Anna Rose mentions a book that you're like, wait, what was that? It'll be in the show notes.
Yeah, another one that I really liked when I was younger and still like, The Secret School by Avi. I really like that one. And the sequel finally just came out last year, and it was also really good. The Secret Sisters.
Oh, okay. I know I have that book on my shelf at home, but I don't know if I've read it personally, The Secret School, although I am a fan of Avi's work. So.
Oh, I think you would really like it. It's
okay.
So good. Yeah. Another childhood favorite that I still really love is From Anna by Jean Little. That's set in the 1930s. And it's also so good. It's not that often that you find a book that has, such excellent characters and story and writing. That one really fits the bill. But yeah, I just have so many historical fiction books that I love for kids. Rosetown by Cynthia Rylant, Patricia Riley Giff's My Name is Rachel, What the Moon Said by Gail Rosengren, All the Kind Family by Sydney Taylor. I really liked Melissa Wiley's Little House in the Highlands.
Yes.
And I liked Cabin Faced West by Jean Fritz. There's a Newbery book. I think it was a Newbery Honor winner from the 50s, The Golden Name Day by Jenny Lindquist. That
I've
one's
never
quite
heard of
fun.
this.
Oh, it's really good.
Okay, The Golden Name Day?
It was republished. It was hard to find for a long time, but they just
Okay.
republished it. I also like Emily's Runaway Imagination. I think that's the only historical that Beverly Cleary ever wrote.
Yeah, I think you're right.
That one's quite good. And I have a few suggestions for teens. So the author of the Betsy Daisy books also wrote Emily of Deep Valley. That one is so good. And I would also say Natalie Perkins has a new book. It came out, I think, last year, Hope in the Valley. It's like upper middle grade. And then another good one for teens would be Up from the Sea by Amanda Dykes. That's a novella set in Maine in the 20s.
I have not read that one yet, but I love Amanda Dykes, so I'm going to have to go look that up. Goodness. Okay, well, all of you watching or listening, I did tell Anna Rose I'd love to fill the show notes to this episode with a ton of book recommendations. And boy, did she deliver, did she not? And of course, we'll also include Anna Rose's books in the show notes as well. The Star That Always Stays, The Luminous Life of Lucy Landry. Highly recommend both. So, Anna Rose, can you talk about what's next for you?
So I can't say a ton yet about it, but I do have another book coming up next year. This is actually the first time that I've talked about it, so you're getting kind of the exclusive.
Very fun.
I have tackled a different time period with this one. This is set at the beginning of World War II, and it's about a girl who moves from England to Wisconsin to live on her grandmother's farm.
Is she like sent away with like the Inland London Blitz, like with the children that were sent away from London, or different?
It is during that general time. Yes.
Okay.
She and her family leave.
Okay, well, World War II is my favorite historical time period to read, so I'm very excited about this. I cannot wait to read it. Anna Rose, thank you so much for the time and the great conversation today. It has been a delight.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was just so much fun.
Show notes for this episode are at readaloudrevival.com. That's where you'll find links to Anna Rose Johnson's books, The Star That Always Stays, The Luminous Life of Lucy Landry. Truly never get tired of saying that title. And also all the books that Anna Rose recommended in this episode. It is chock full. So if you are a historical fiction lover, you're in luck. We have so much good reading to do, don't we? I'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. But in the meantime, you know what to do. Go make meaningful and lasting connections with your kids through books.